Captain's log. Stardate 51111.75. We are now less than 24 hours from our objective, the Tyrus system. Despite the anxiety, morale among the crew is high. Truth be told, I think we've all been spoiling for the fight, especially the young hands. I just hope their energy will make up for their inexperience. It's funny, not long ago I was certain my days of gallivanting around the cosmos were over. So much for it being a young man's game. But I'd be lying if I said I hadn't missed it a little bit. Even so, I was loath to leave. The camellia me and Julie planted last year was just about to come into flower. I'd hate to miss it, and there's still so much else to do with the garden. Hopefully, if it all goes well tomorrow, I can go home soon. Maybe even catch the camellia while it's still in flower. And see Julie again, I suppose. All going well. End log. By early March of 2374, Starfleet had spent almost 3 months in continuous retreat as Dominion fleets swarmed through Federation space, practically unchallenged, leaving many member worlds in Dominion clutches. Morale amongst the ranks is rapidly plummeting. A retreating force is hardly ever in love with its commander. Yet while it might be unpopular, it is unfortunately highly necessary. The Dominion outnumbers Starfleet more than 3 to 1. While a fleet in a strong position may well be able to repel a Dominion assault, it can do nothing to stop them as they choose to bypass systems. During the early stages of the war, the Dominion hoped to use this numbers advantage to outmaneuver and surround the Federation fleets, and it was precisely this that Starfleet Command wanted to avoid, instituting the unpopular policy of tactical retreat. Despite its unpopularity, it was successful, preserving the core of Starfleet and its experienced officers, trading territory for what was most desperately needed: time. Time for the rest of the fleet to make it to the front lines, time for the Klingons to mobilize, and time for Starfleet to call up her reserves. While Starfleet at this time only consisted of just over 600 active ships, she had an extensive reserve of ships and personnel which could be called on. A standby reserve of 300 ships that could be mobilized within a month. By late February of 2374, these 3 fleets had been mobilized, with the 9th Fleet at Benzar, the 8th at Sol, and the 7th at Gaza Prime. Yet none of these 3 fleets had experienced combat officers or modern starships, which were already at the front lines. Although this was by no means a crippling flaw, since these fleets were simply expected to plug gaps in the line and not intended for a large-scale offensive action. This was reflected in the composition of these fleets, largely consisting of Excelsior derivatives, such as the Centaur and Curry classes. Hastily developed after the second Borg invasion, the Curry class was intended to further augment fleets with a fighter contingent, as small maneuverable attack fighters had proved highly effective during the Maquis conflict. As such, the Curry sacrifices most of its armament to instead house its complement of up to 12 Peregrine-class space superiority fighters. While unwieldy and unconventional, the Curry class was easy to produce and simple to operate, holding the line while more powerful modern vessels were under construction. In the meantime, the fighting tip of the reserve fleets would be the Ambassador class. When it was launched in the 2330s, it was easily the most powerful ship in the quadrant and distinguished itself during the Cardassian border wars, but by the 2370s it found itself pushed out of the top tiers by the Galaxy and Nebula classes. Yet unlike the Excelsior, it proved ineffective as a cruiser, being too slow, but also too undergunned. Nevertheless, in the early stages of the war, it frequently found itself standing in for the sorely needed Galaxy-class battleships. Moreover, the officers commanding these ships were mostly drawn from administrative and scientific postings, with very little combat experience. And while the flag officers were largely drawn from semi-retired reservists, whose experience it was hoped would compensate for any shortcomings in their ships and crew, this was not an entirely unreasonable proposition, since many of them were veterans of the Cardassian border wars, and were well versed in enemy tactics. For this reason, the reserve fleets were given the nickname the Golden Oldies. However, their architect, Fleet Admiral Baran, was not content with simply holding the line. Rather, he envisaged them changing the course of the entire war. By late February, the Dominion had consumed a vast swath of Federation territory, including the Maxia Actium Wall, a chain of 3 fortified star bases. Housed within these were some 63 starships, as well as swarms of fighters and runabouts, all trapped by Dominion blockades. Baran believed that if these ships could break loose, they could turn the tide on the front and potentially cause a collapse in the entire Kelrabi front. If only they could break those ships loose. Admiral de Gret of the newly formed 7th Fleet, also desperate to get his fleet into action, agreed with Baran that it was time to go on the offensive, and the two began to develop a plan of attack. With the Dominion having taken so much territory so quickly, their lines were stretched thin. Baran believed that if a breakthrough was achieved, the Dominion would be unable to counter it, and they could relieve the besieged starbases, adding their ships to their ranks. In order to achieve this breakthrough, a two-pronged attack was planned, with the 5th Fleet ordered to seize Caferia, driving a wedge between the two Dominion fleet groups, and hopefully forcing the Dominion to reinforce that sector, leaving the Tyra system lightly defended and vulnerable to a breakthrough by the 7th, who would then push on to relieve Starbase Cerebus before then liberating Zindikabu and Actium. Desperate to end the cycle of engage and retreat, and raise morale with a victory, Starfleet Command was easily persuaded and approved the plan. Baran hoped that this would vindicate his faith in his Golden Oldies. It now fell to Admiral de Gret to carry out this bold offensive. It was not lost on the Dominion the threat posed by these starbases, and so they began to systematically assault them, with the goal of either capturing them but destroying them when necessary. Although he didn't realize it, de Gret was now on a ticking clock, and time was running out. By February 20th, Admiral de Gret had assembled a force of 112 ships, 14 wings, including 2 ambassador wings, 4 cruiser wings, 3 frigate wings, 2 light wings, 2 carrier wings, and a support wing. While such fleets were increasingly the norm, most of the officers in the 7th had little experience operating with such a large force. Even for veterans of the Cardassian Wars, the sheer scale of modern war was unlike anything they had previously experienced. And so, when de Gret began preparations for the offensive, he began to realize the difficulties in simply organizing and concentrating such a force, let alone fighting with it. Yet, he shared none of these concerns, as he was determined to prove himself. And so, Operation Macedon was set to begin on February 28th. Yet, unbeknownst to de Gret, on February 23rd, a courier ship returning from the Oniaka system was ambushed by a Jem'hadar patrol, who easily overpowered and captured the vessel, which was carrying a copy of the 7th Fleet's battle plan, and was now in Dominion hands. Initially, the local Vorta viewed the document with skepticism. Starfleet had spent the last 2 months on the run, and she struggled to believe that they were all of a sudden ready to counterattack. However, these doubts were eventually pushed aside by subsequent reconnaissance, which confirmed that the 7th Fleet was in fact preparing to mobilize. providing her a rare opportunity of engaging a full Federation fleet, she wasted no time and called for support to greet the 7th Fleet. She would be joined by the newly formed Cardassian 13th Order under Legate Petar. They would also be joined by the 8th Order 1st Assault Division, which was fresh off their victory at Cerebus, and thus the Dominion would outnumber Degret 2-1. Unaware that the Dominion knew every move he was going to make, Degret departed Gazar Prime on February 28th, exactly as planned, unaware of what awaited him. And so, on March 10th, 2374, Degret arrived in the Tyra system, exactly on schedule. Everything seemed to match their intelligence reports, with an understrength Dominion fleet of 70 ships, holding in a defensive position between the 6th and 7th planet. Suspecting nothing, Degret engaged, forming his fleet into a battle line, before opening fire with a torpedo barrage. After several exchanges, the Dominion lines began to falter and fall back. This surprised Degret, who had been told to expect the Jem'hadar to stand their ground regardless, and so he advanced cautiously, keeping his range and continuing a torpedo barrage, only for the Jem'hadar to again fall back, drawing Degret further between the two planets. Still, Degret kept his distance, wary of the Jem'hadar. The Vorta soon decided that if she was to make her enemy commit, she would have to do it herself, and so she charged her ships headlong into Degrev's fleet, engaging him in CQB. This took Degrev by surprise, who didn't expect such a reckless aggression from the Jem'hadar. Nevertheless, he still outnumbered them and began to close ranks. Finally, he was where Petar wanted him, and so Legate Petar sprung his trap, revealing the rest of his fleet, which had been hiding in the magnetic poles of the two planets, and now moved to box them in and trap the 7th Fleet between the two planets. Degret, still preoccupied with the enemy to his front, did not realize what was happening until it was too late, and the trap was closed. Even so, the 7th Fleet was largely at full strength, and the commanders of the flank wings reacted quickly and began to form a defensive square, forcing the Jem'hadar to disengage from CQB, and another round of torpedo exchanges began. But this time, the Dominion would have the advantage, with two Cardassian artillery lines consisting of Brinnock and Vassad destroyers now joining the battle, as well as the newly launched Hutet. Facing firepower of such magnitude, Degret knew that he could not stay here, and with his fleet still largely in good order, he prepared to break out of the Encirclement. He ordered the fleet to launch all fighters and begin engaging the enemy line at the point between the Jem'hadar and Cardassian fleets, hoping to disorder them. Unfortunately, this would cost Degret, who by committing his own fighters, left the fleet vulnerable to those of the enemy. And Legate Petar launched over 180 fighters, attacking the tightly packed Federation formations, disordering them and heavily damaging numerous ships. Still, they held the line, buying Degret precious time as he moved his attack wings into position, preparing to punch through the Dominion line. However, Petar realized what Degret planned and moved to counter, moving his recon lines to plug the gap. And so when Degret's attack wings charged, they were met by Cardassian Rysalax, perfectly able to match the Federation attack wings, and they were soon repulsed with heavy casualties. Meanwhile, after sustaining heavy losses from repeated Cardassian volleys and fighter attack, the line holding the left began to falter. The Cardassian line commander facing them saw an opportunity for glory and charged the Federation line unsupported, leaving a gap for the Federation to exploit. Seeing what might be his only chance, Degret charged the gap with his ambassador wing, leading with his own flagship, the North Star, blowing past the Cardassian cruisers. Yet just as it seemed that they had broken free, the Hutet swung round and hit North Star with a full volley, destroying her and closing the gap. With the flagship destroyed, the 7th Fleet was left confused and leaderless. The responsibility and initiative now fell to the inexperienced wing commanders who desperately tried to keep cohesion and break out of this lethal encirclement. The Cardassians continued their merciless bombardment, closing their grip ever tighter, focusing fire on the older, weaker starships and local command ships with the hope of destroying Federation morale. Despite this, Starfleet fought on doggedly, with wing commanders working desperately to try and coordinate a breakout and organize stragglers into ad hoc units. For 2 long hours, Petar continued to pound the Federation from range, until finally, satisfied that they were softened up, closed the circle. It seemed to Petar that it would now be a mere matter of mopping up, yet he was sorely mistaken. As 2 wings broke formation, still in good order, they ran for the gap, which had opened as the Cardassians had closed in. The 2 wings had maintained good cohesion and successfully broke out, fleeing towards friendly lines at maximum warp. Petar released 2 recon lines to pursue, managing to disable 2 ships before the remaining 14 broke away. Even so, it was of little consequence. The rest of the 7th Fleet was trapped and within an hour was utterly obliterated, and the Battle of Tyra came to an end, and was yet another resounding Dominion victory. In just 3 hours, Starfleet had lost 98 ships, an entire fleet group destroyed. This was an even greater disaster than the infamous Battle of Wolf 359, just 8 years before. Casualty estimates vary greatly, with the lowest being 24,000 and the highest listing over 56,000 people killed, all in just 3 hours. Such is the nature of modern war. A war in which a single mistake by those in charge can result in tens of thousands of deaths. A war in which starships, the fruits of years of work and cutting-edge scientific research, a home for hundreds and the embodiment of their hopes and ambitions, can be torn apart in the blink of an eye. A war in which both soldier and scientist would stand shoulder to shoulder and die in their millions. This was modern war. With the Battle of Tyra being the most catastrophic loss of life in Starfleet's history, Fleet Admiral Baran stepped down in disgrace. But the damage was already done. If Starfleet continued to take these kinds of losses, then it would be a matter of mere months until Starfleet would be utterly destroyed and the Federation would fall under the flag of the Dominion.